All right, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I'm with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the entire world. And we are really excited this month of February because all month long, in commemoration of February 11th, which is the International Day for Women and Girls in STEM, we are only doing hangouts with amazing women from around the globe. So by the end of this month, it will be over 40 hangouts with incredible women, which is the most we've ever done. And it's just been such a thrill having you guys be a part. 5 classes here today. I'm going to introduce them in just a second, but thanks for being a part of our biggest festival we've ever done. We appreciate it immensely. So we are joined by Miss Malkinson's grade 3s in Dawson Creek, British Columbia. Hi, guys. Hi. Awesome. We are joined by Mr. Goudreau's class, filling in 9 through 12s in Aurora, Ontario. Yes, can I just say, like, grade 9 through 12 never actually yell, so I appreciate it so much. Way to go, guys. We've got Mrs. Zaborowski's grade 5s in Woodbury, who are super enthusiastic. We've got Miss Parmar's grade 1 and 2s in Kelowna, BC. Hi, guys. Your muting still isn't working, but they're excited. That's all that matters. And then we've got Miss Bergeron's grade 5s, also in Woodbury, Connecticut. Hi, guys.
Hi!
When they're so loud it like breaks the mic a little, it's a good sign. Of course, the reason you guys are all here today is for our speaker. So we are joined live in Delaware from the University of Delaware by Imogene Castellari. She is a wildlife biologist who studies rare and elusive species. She's a National Geographic explorer. She gets to work on snow leopards, one of the coolest animals in the world. And in addition to all her research, she is a really prominent science communicator. So for kids speaking in your language, over 13,000 followers on Instagram, over 15,000 on Twitter. She shares a lot about the work that she does and for a love of wildlife generally. We're so thrilled to have her with us today. You're muted, Imogene, so just get ready, but for some reason it's not letting me demute you. But without further ado, I'll let you take it away. And thanks so much for joining us today. Go right ahead.
Hi, how's everybody doing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Imogene Castellari. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Delaware, and I am focusing on snow leopard genetics, which is something that I will be talking about here in this presentation. But I will also be spending some time talking with you about how I became a scientist and why I think studying carnivores is really important for conservation. So what I am going to do right now is share the screen. I've got a presentation for you, so you won't see my face for a little bit, but you will see the presentation. I've got some cool photos, and then afterwards we will have time for questions. Does that sound good to everybody?
Sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, so let's see. 1 second. You're going to see yourselves as I'm sharing the screen. This is always an interesting part.
Yeah.
All right, so screen sharing. All right, everyone wave at yourself while I pull up the PowerPoint. Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so today the title of my talk is about big cats, but I am going to give some love to some of the little cats too, as indicated by this photo here. This is a photo from my master's degree, which focused on bobcat genetics in Texas, and that is an anesthetized bobcat. He's got his tongue sticking out because we caught him in a trap, and then we gave him a medicine much like we humans would get if we were at a hospital having surgery. So it puts us to sleep for a little while, and then we're able to fit this animal with a radio collar, and then once he recovered, we released him. But this was during the wake-up process, so his eyes are a little bit open, but he's still under the influence of the medication, so he is still kind of floppy and he's not dangerous. But once he woke up, once he is awake, you can never hold a wild animal or any wild cat like this. That cat would definitely probably rip my face off. So I just want to go ahead and make that plug. You should never try this at home unless you have a trained professional with you. So to go ahead and dive right in, I feel like I'm probably like a lot of people that are watching this, and that I am a wildlife biologist because I like animals. I'm assuming most of you guys are here listening today because you like animals as well. But unfortunately, you guys have this really cool benefit that I did not have as a kid, and that's access to scientists and people who are doing different types of research. When I was your age and younger, I honestly didn't know that there were so many different ways to enjoy animals or appreciate wildlife in a job type setting. So for me, I grew up on a farm and we had dairy goats and we had cows and pigs. And as a result, I thought that being enjoying wildlife or enjoying animals meant that I should be a veterinarian. So all my entire life, growing up, working on a farm, working with veterinarians and for veterinarians, I went to college as a pre-veterinary student, thinking that when I got my bachelor's degree that I would end up focusing on animal medicine. And here on the left, I'm, working with cattle, and on the right, I went to Australia as an undergraduate to learn a little bit about domestic livestock and wildlife medicine. And in this photo on the right, I am taking the heartbeat of a horse. And, I realized on this trip, this was my first time learning that there are other ways to be there are other ways to enjoy wildlife. So that's kind of my journey. The beginning of my journey in Australia marked the start of my career as a wildlife biologist. And when I realized towards the end of my bachelor's degree that I liked wildlife, and more specifically that there were other ways to enjoy nature and wild animals or domestic animals outside of just being a veterinarian, I started getting involved in different capacities. What these photos right here represent is a period of time where I worked in wildlife rehabilitation. So I worked at a clinic that received animals that had been injured. Either they were hit by a car, or they'd fallen out of a nest, or maybe someone's cat had attacked the animal, and we nursed them back to health with the intent to release them back into the wild. So the photo on the left is me and a juvenile shrike, which is a really cool bird of prey. A cool predator that predates on lizards and mice. And then on the right, there's a really cute baby opossum that it had fallen out of a nest and we couldn't find its mother. So I worked in this capacity for a relatively short period of time, and that really kind of gave me my introduction to wildlife. Growing up on a farm, you see wildlife, but you don't really interact with them very much. Most of us don't interact with them. And I was able to handle birds like raptors, like this kite on the right. I was able to work with educational animals like this possum. We took care of snakes and squirrels and owls, and that really introduced me to the huge myriad, or to the huge variety of wildlife that needed our help. And so after I came back from Australia, and after I was done working in wildlife rehabilitation, I realized I was still very interested in carnivores. I love all wildlife, but my introduction to conservation with regards to big cats came from a time that I worked at a tiger sanctuary in North Carolina. We took care of animals that had been in captivity. Private people like you and me had them as pets, and then realized that they don't make good pets because they're dangerous and they need a lot of space, and they have a lot of food requirements that are just not well suited to life as a pet. So I worked at the sanctuary where we took these animals and let them live out their lives in the most natural way possible. We did all types of medical work with them. We didn't interact with them as pets. And so it wasn't like a circus. And this was my realization that working with wildlife was important from a conservation perspective. So the thing that was the most shocking for me to learn when I was at this point in my career was that there are more tigers that are in captivity, privately owned, than there are left in the wild. And that's just in the United States alone. There are more tigers in captivity than there are left in the wild. And it takes a lot to take care of wild animals in captivity. And what these photos show are some of the medical work that I was able to do with tigers and small cats like bobcats and servals and caracals. And what I'm doing here on the left is we were inserting a medication into a chicken. So, carnivores eat meat. And since cats are obligate carnivores, we had to make sure they had a proper diet. And that involved giving them medication, like deworming medication, things that you at home would give a pet dog or a pet cat. And we had to give them vaccinations as well, which is what the photo on the right is. And the reason that I'm showing these photos is because it showed me just how complex taking care of animals in captivity can be. And the question that I had about this is, where are people getting tigers? Where, if anybody in the United States can own a tiger as a pet, whether it's legal or not, where are they getting these tigers? And the answer is always from the wild. And that's a huge problem for conservation. And that really is what initiated my interest in becoming a wildlife biologist and a conservationist, specifically working with carnivores. I transitioned from being interested in veterinary medicine as an undergraduate, to working in wildlife rehabilitation, to seeing what it was like to work at a zoo. But my interest lied in working with wild animals, animals that are not in cages, animals that never interact with humans. So when I graduated, these two photos, I love them because they're from my very first job after I got my bachelor's degree. I moved to Northwest Montana to chase bobcats. And this project, we were catching bobcats and putting collars on their neck in order to trace their locations. And the photo on the right is me trying to find a bobcat. So in the background, you see all those trees and you see some mountains in the background. Somewhere out there within about 2 miles is one of our bobcats. And I know that from the equipment that I'm holding. So we were monitoring their movements and seeing what their diet was like. And this was really helpful for their management. And on the left, I've got a bobcat that's anesthetized. He does look like he's awake. His eyes are open. That's because he's recovering from the medicine. And that was my first experience working with wild cats. So obviously I'd done some stuff with tigers and they were captive, and that was really awesome. But this was my first experience working with free-ranging wildlife. And this is what made, for me, was the transition from, I don't want to work at a zoo. I want to be able to protect the animals that are wild. And these two photos were taken in 2010, so that's 9 years ago. It's been a long time. And since then, I've worked in a variety of different jobs as a scientist and continued to train as a scientist. And I realized that I was interested in carnivores. And even though now I'm focusing on cats almost exclusively, I still had to put in a lot of hours and time to learn about different scientific techniques. And the reason that's important is because if you want to be a wildlife biologist, it's not just about learning one animal. Very few people go on to become a wolf biologist or a dolphin biologist or a rattlesnake biologist. You're generally going to be a biologist that studies different systems or different groups of animals. But in order to do that, we have to understand everything about that animal's life. It's not just about knowing how far an individual bear can travel. It's about understanding what he eats. It's about understanding what are the threats to his movement. How do roads impact their movement? How does human presence impact the ability for their babies to be successful on the landscape? And so this is a photo of a bear that's again sleeping. So none of the photos that you see, the animals are all alive. Every single one is alive, but they are anesthetized through a drug that we gave it under trained supervision. And we were fitting this animal with radio collars to see what it's doing out in the wild. And that really, is developing skills for a variety of different projects. And after I worked on bears, I worked with salamanders. Salamanders are really cool. They're one of my favorite species in the entire world. I won't talk too much about them since today is about big cats, but I really liked working with a lot of different species in a lot of different capacities. I've also worked with different reptiles. So that's a photo of me holding a baby alligator that we caught for part of a research project. And I've also been able to volunteer on other people's projects. So this is a gopher tortoise, which is a state threatened species down in Georgia here in the United States. And I have some friends that were conducting research on it, and part of my training involved learning from them. So becoming a wildlife biologist is really about learning a lot of different unique and diverse techniques, both to capture wildlife, to handle wildlife, as well as to study what is important about their conservation. And what I did for all of these projects was different. Some of the projects we were interested in genetics and DNA. Others we were interested in movement. Some we were interested in understanding their migratory patterns, as well as things that make them successful. But all of that, after about 2 years, that translated into me going back to school to receive my master's degree. And that project focused on bobcats. Starting to see a trend here. This is the second time that I officially had worked on bobcats. And this really was my main interest, even though I was working on a lot of different species. I worked on bears and foxes, and I worked with clouded leopards in the lab, and I worked with wolverines and black bears and martens and fishers, which are a weasel. I was really primarily interested in carnivores, but more specifically in cats. And my master's degree focused on the genetic structure of bobcats in Texas. And even though I'm a wildlife biologist or a conservation biologist, that's kind of my title, the areas or the disciplines that I work in as a scientist are in an area called molecular ecology. And molecular ecology is the field that studies the genetics or gene flow of animals. And the reason that's really important for conservation is because when an animal goes from point A to point B and then has babies, those babies share genetic history with their parents. And by studying these types of relationships over large tracts of land in different parts of the world, we get to understand as scientists how animals are moving across a landscape. We understand how they're physically connected to one another, how they are historically connected to one another. We can figure out how many animals there are on a landscape, and we can figure out the things that might be helpful or harmful to those movements. And for this project, I was really interested in understanding how things like farms and ag land and rangeland impact bobcat relationships and connectivity across a huge section of the state of Texas. And the cool part is, you know, I did get to handle some bobcats. I got to catch a baby bobcat, which is in the top left. I got to anesthetize bobcats that you see in the bottom photo and on the right. And, you know, now that this project is done, I'm doing the second part of the component of that, which is writing up the report that is going to be made available to the public so they can see the results, which hopefully will be informative to management down the road. And so this really is what initiated my interest in working in genetics. That's kind of the technique that I use. And I always like to tell people that if you want to be a scientist, if you want to be a wildlife biologist, it's important that you pick a couple different things. In order to be useful for conservation and for science, we have to pick kind of a discipline to work in, and in order to address questions in an interesting way. And for me, the way that I do that is with genetics. Some people do that by studying diseases, they study diet, they study movement, they analyze numbers, and you can do this with all different types of species, but this is, right now, I'm at the part of my career where I'm doing this primarily with cats. And now I'm currently in the third year of my PhD focusing on snow leopard genetics, which I'm going to talk about here in a little bit more detail in a second. But, you know, in order to actually figure out why you're going to study a species, you have to answer a couple different questions. And the first thing that I want to point out with regards to big cats is, why are they important? Now, the cheetah, which is what the clip that we're looking at right now, the cheetah is the cat that got me interested in big cats in general. Everybody loves cheetahs. They're the coolest cat. They're one of the coolest cats on the planet. And I love this video because a fun fact about cheetahs is that they can go from standing still to running, and they can reach speeds of 60 miles per hour in just 3 seconds. And that is just amazing to me. And this slow-mo clip, what it doesn't show you is that the distance between the paws of that cat as she's running, as you know, you see that foot going down now, and the other ones are coming down. As she's about to stretch out again, she can have a distance of up to 25 feet per stride. And I think that's just really amazing. And you know, the cheetahs are really cool by themselves, but they're also really important on the ecosystem, just like all of the cats on our planet. There are 37 different species of cat, and almost every single one of them is declining. They're either threatened, or they're endangered, or they're critically endangered, meaning they are facing great likelihood of becoming extinct. And this is a problem because not only are these cats beautiful, like you can see in this video, but they're also ecologically important because they serve as what's called an umbrella species, or an ecosystem indicator. And what that means is large cats require so much land and so much resources that if we are able to protect them, we're able to protect a lot of other species as well. That's where the term umbrella species comes in. If we protect them, their protection kind of is an umbrella over other species, which I feel like is really useful for conservation. And they're so important on landscapes. And there are a lot of different examples of that, and I'll briefly give you some. Some of my favorite cats that are so important for the ecosystems they live in. This is called a caracal. It's a small cat that's an African grassland species, and they can jump upwards of 15 feet, which is a fun, cool fact, but they're also really important for structuring bird populations and rodent populations, and their presence on the landscape helps structure the movement and numbers of so many other species. Another species that I think is really, really cool for just in general, and it also happens to be threatened with extinction, is the clouded leopard. This is a cat species that I worked on at the Smithsonian, and these cats are in Central Asia or South Central Asia. And what's really cool about them is that their ankles can turn totally backwards, which is what you're seeing in the video. And as a result, they're one of the only cat species that can climb down a tree head first. Unfortunately, these guys are often poached for their fur, and their populations are declining as well. And you know, they serve as ecosystem indicators in their environment, just like the caracal, just like the cheetah, just like every other cat species. Now, this is the snow leopard, which I'll talk more about my research in a second, but this is this is probably maybe my favorite cat species. The snow leopard lives in Central Asia in 12 different countries, and they are called the ghost of the mountain. And the reason they're called this is because they live at the roof of the world. They live in really high, snowy environments that are very cold and very mountainous. In this video, you're seeing just how amazing these cats are, because this cat is trying to catch an ibex, and she's running straight down a mountain. And she's doing it successfully. And, you know, these cats are just so incredibly amazing, and they help structure populations of free-ranging wild goats out in their habitat. And they're really important for conservation because snow leopards, where they live in a part of the world that provides about 60% of the fresh water that feeds the entire world. So their conservation has direct implications for people. And one of the last species that I just think is really cool is called the fishing cat. This is another South Asian cat species, and they're a fishing specialist. And what we're seeing in this video is they tap the top of the water to mimic an insect, and that attracts fish. And then when the fish comes close enough, without realizing there's a cat there, the cat snatches it and is able to grab lunch. And these cats are often, unfortunately, persecuted by humans as being a nuisance animal, like so many cats are. And I just think they're really important and really cool. And these are just a couple examples of why cats in general, big cats and small cats alike, are so interesting and why they're important for conservation. But what we're seeing here is there's 4 different examples, or 4 different cats on the board, 4 different cat species, and they're blending in with their environment. The reason we study cats, like I already said, is because they're important for the ecosystem, but we also study them because we need to know more about them. In every part of the world, for cats, they're often difficult to find, either because they blend in, just like the tiger in the top left, or the sand cat in the bottom right, or they live in hard to reach places. Like physically, we can't get to them because they're in trees, like the ocelot in the top right. Or in the bottom left, there is a snow leopard. I will give you about 10 seconds to see if you can find it, and then I'll show you. But they also, but the point that I'm making here is that they're really hard to find. Carnivores exist at lower densities than game animals like deer or turkeys. And that's because of energy on the landscape. So because they're predators, because they're eating other animals, we wouldn't be able, the ecosystem would not work if there were the same amount of tigers as there were to ungulate species, their prey items. So they exist at a lower density, and they're harder to find, and they live in places that are difficult for us to access. So as researchers, we study them because we want to help their conservation, but we also want to help the conservation of other species. And that's where my research comes in with the snow leopards. But the problem with snow leopards is they're very difficult to access, and they're even harder to find, as is indicated by the bottom left, which I'm going to show you where that snow leopard is. Right there. I'll give you a second to see if you can go up and actually see his face, but they blend in so perfectly with their environment, you can be staring right at one and have no idea that it's there. The other reason that it's important to talk about conservation is because all of these cats are on decline, and one of the problems that we face with cat conservation across the world is poaching. Things like habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, human development, and poaching are huge issues for cats all across the world, and it makes my job much more difficult, but it also makes it hard for the people that live alongside these animals, because if we have less habitat for them, that means there's less food for them, and they're more likely to try to come into human habitat and human ranges and take livestock, and that creates human wildlife conflicts that are present all over the world for species like the snow leopard and the tiger or the cheetah, or even something small like a bobcat. And so my research really is trying to answer a lot of different questions. The snow leopard, all of the cat species are very cool, but the snow leopard is definitely my favorite. They exist in 12 different countries in Central Asia, and there's a lot that we don't know about them. They live at the roof of the world, just like this cat here in a country called Tajikistan, which is in Central Asia. And there's a lot that we don't know about them. And my lab focuses on rare and elusive species, and we do research on cats like the snow leopard in a lot of different ways. We focus on their movement, we focus on their interaction with hunting, we focus on their interactions with their prey species, and we also study their genetic structure, which is what my research focuses on. And I'm specifically trying to answer questions that we don't know yet about snow leopards. Like, we don't know how many snow leopards, or I'm sorry, we don't know how many populations of snow leopards there are across 12 countries in Central Asia. It's a huge part of the world for them to live in, and there's so much that we don't know. So in this picture right here it's a map of Central Asia. And the dark blue sections are the entire portion of snow leopard range. And this includes countries like Russia and Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan and Afghanistan and India and Nepal and China. And I'm trying to answer questions like, where are snow leopard populations? We know that there are snow leopards in this whole blue section of Central Asia, but this is like 2 billion acres. Or 2 million miles of habitat. That's a lot of space for snow leopards, and there's so much that we don't know, like how many populations are there? And more specifically, how does the landscape impact their movement? So how do things like mountains or rivers or human development influence the way that they're related to one another and the way that they're connected? And the reason this is important for conservation is because when we understand how many snow leopard populations there are or where they are on a landscape, we're better able to inform landscape planning. Like the snow leopard is really about working with communities, and it's really about setting aside habitat in like protected areas like parks and conservation initiatives that protect the habitat that these species live in. That's how we save species, and that involves working with communities. And because I said snow leopards are really hard to find, I can't go out to all these different countries and all these different places to catch snow leopards. I'm not going to catch 10 snow leopards probably in this whole area, let alone like 400. So I'm doing research non-invasively. In order to do my type of research, I combine field and lab techniques. And what you're seeing in these other two photos is that in the top photo, you're seeing someone holding something in their hand, and down at the bottom of their hand is a piece of snow leopard poop. You heard that right, folks. I am a poop scientist, and that's how I do my research. And we go out and we find snow leopard poop on the tops of mountains, which is where they move, and we collect that data, and then I bring it back into the laboratory. And from those individual pieces of poop, I am able to identify different snow leopards. So I can identify snow leopards. We'll just call them Carl, Bob, and Shannon. And I can tell you that Carl pooped here and Shannon pooped here. And then I can tell you how related they are to one another. And then once we have that information, we can do all sorts of analyses to figure out the questions that I've listed above, like where are these populations and how many are there? And then we can try to find relationships between snow leopard movement and the landscape, which will be really useful in the future for conservation groups to plan, do landscape planning, or to work with one another to reveal new questions about science. And that's really what I'm doing for my entire project. And that's similar to the project that I did for my master's on bobcats. And that's really the type of scientist that I am. And the whole goal of this research is really to just make sure that these cats are there in the future. I'm interested in protecting populations of snow leopards so that they are there for future generations. I might not ever see the snow leopards in this video, but that's okay. That's not the type of scientist I am. My job is not to go out and catch them. My job is to study them in such a way that we can, as humans, impact their conservation. We can make sure we are doing the right things in order to make sure that these cats are there for generations to come. And this type of research can be done on snow leopards. It can be done on grizzly bears. It can be done on peregrine falcons. I just happen to do this type of science on big cats. And hopefully that's something that I will be able to do for many years for many species. And that's really what I wanted. That's really all I had to talk about initially with big cats. It's kind of a lot of information for a whirlwind. It's a whirlwind of information to throw at you. I think I already went a few minutes over, so I'm going to go ahead and stop now and give you guys a chance to ask some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you guys can hopefully see me.
We can.
Awesome, perfect. So now I'm back, and if you have questions, I can answer specific things, or we can talk about something totally different.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much, Imogene. That was an amazing presentation. For the classes, too, when we're done, I'm going to send you guys a snow leopard hunting video from the BBC because it's one of the best videos you'll ever see online ever. So do check it out. We'll start with, actually, before we start, there's a few groups watching on YouTube Live. If you guys want to type in questions in the chat bar, I will pass them on. Don't be shy. Please do that. But let's start with Miss Malkinson's class. If you guys have a question to kick us off, go right ahead. Should be good to go. I'm having, oh, there we go. Yeah.
How long have you studied for?
Oh, how long have I studied for? That was the question. A very, very long time. So I'm 32 years old. And I am almost done with school. So I have been studying I've been studying science in college since I was 18. So how does math work? Is that 14 years? 10?
14 years.
14 years. So I'm almost done. I'm not taking classes anymore. So I'm technically still a student, but I was done with classes in 2018. So it's a long time, but I'm finally done with classes. So that's good.
Yes, that is very good. Well, congrats. All right, Mr. Gudrow's class, if you guys have a question.
Yes, hi there.
Hi.
Hi, Imogen. Thank you so much for sharing all this research you've done. One of our students that's not allowed to show his face in public in our classroom asked the question, what should you do if a big cat were to spot and chase you?
Right. Okay. So that's a great question. It's something that we're seeing. We recently saw in the news, this happened to somebody recently, and how you respond to wildlife depends on the species. And the number one thing that I'll say for cats is that you never, ever run. First of all, it's very unlikely that you would ever be attacked by something like a mountain lion or a bobcat or even something like a bear or a wolf. But with large cats, the first thing that you want to do is make yourself appear big. So that involves raising your arms up, yelling, making a lot of noise. If you have something you can throw it. But you should never crouch down because that makes you appear small, and you should never run. And the reason you should never run is because just like any predator, they're ambush predators. They are trying to catch things that are trying to get away from them. So if you run, you're going to trigger that desire for them to chase you, and you're more likely to be hurt. Unfortunately, not every single time does getting big and throwing something work. It's very unlikely that an animal would still attack you, but if that happens, you should always fight back, because they've attacked you because they think that you're food. Again, that's very, very unlikely to happen, but in the case that it does happen, if yelling, getting big doesn't work, and it does actually attack you, you should fight back with every tool that you have available, like picking up sticks, rocks. But the number one thing that I'll say in addition to that is that if you're hiking in an area where you know there is something like a mountain lion, you should always carry what's called bear spray. Bear spray is like pepper spray, and it's in a big canister like this, and it shoots out like 15 feet. And if you hit a bear or a mountain lion in the face with that, they're going to turn tail and run away. So that's probably my recommendation, and also not running.
Because as we learned from the cheetah, if you try and run, they will catch you. They are much faster than you, every cat.
Yep. Yeah. And I'm not a fast runner, so I think a bobcat could probably catch me too.
Awesome. All right. So the other classes, I just want to note, for whatever reason, it's not going to let me demute you guys. So for all the classes, when I prompt you guys, there's a little microphone symbol at the top of your screen, and if you click that, you'll be demuted. So we're going to start with Mrs. Zaborowski's class, and if you guys have a question, come on up, okay? And I'll let you know when you're demuted. There you go. You're good.
You can go up and ask. Would you introduce, you can say, I'm Sammy.
I'm Sammy, and if someone wants to become a future vet or biologist, what advice would you give them?
Cool. So the question was, if someone wants to be a veterinarian or a wildlife biologist, what should they do? So there's two different paths, and I will answer them separately. So I really thought that I wanted to be a veterinarian for a long time. And so what I did prior to getting into college was trying to learn a lot about what it means to be a veterinarian. Some students, before they enter college, are able to go shadow a veterinarian, where they're able to go to like a vet clinic and see what they do, and maybe learn about giving vaccinations to an animal. Depending on where you are and how old you are, some of that might not be available until you get to college. But choosing a major is what's really, really important. So my bachelor's degree is in animal science, which is a degree that is really well suited for someone who wants to go to veterinary school. So when I got into college and I chose that major, I focused on making really good grades, because you have to have all A's if you want to go to vet school, because it's really hard to get into. But you also want to have experience. So once you're old enough, then you can get a job at a vet clinic and start to learn how to do some of those like techniques and practices yourself. And then you apply for it once you're done with your bachelor's degree. And then if you get in, then you have 4 more years of school in order to be a veterinarian. And that way you can learn about things like livestock, pets, maybe even wildlife as well, depending on the school that you're at. But if you decided, like me, at the end of that degree that you wanted to be a wildlife biologist, you have to do things a little bit differently. So my degree is in animal science, but animal science as a degree is not really well suited to being a wildlife biologist by itself, because the techniques and the classes that I took were more suited to medicine and for animals that were in captivity. I have handled a lot of wildlife, but I don't do that a lot right now. And so learning about medicine and physiology doesn't really help me be a biologist. So if I had chosen a different major like wildlife biology or ecology or fisheries and wildlife management, those would have given me the classes and the skills in order to be more competitive for jobs. So what I did to make up for that was I worked for 2 years prior to starting my next degree, and that's when I was catching bobcats and studying bears and studying other different carnivores in the United States to learn the skills that I didn't get during my bachelor's degree. So in order to be either a veterinarian or a wildlife biologist, it does involve a lot of school. It involves making good grades. It involves being involved. It's not just about going to class and learning and then going home and doing your homework. It's about being in class, but then also getting your hands dirty. So that means like going outside and hiking and learning about the animals that you want to work with, and having like a well-rounded application. But some of you guys are a couple years out from that, so that's okay. You've got plenty of time to decide what you want to do and then to develop the skills that you want to do it. But starting as early as possible is good.
Yeah, so one of the things I just want to follow up on quickly is that with a lot of students, we find that students feel that you need to be acing science from the get-go, from a really early age, all the way through university, and certainly at a point you do need to get all A's. Can you speak really briefly to the idea that maybe students, you know, you could have different interests when you're younger, you can try science out, you might fail along the way, anything like that?
Right. No, that's a great point, Jesse. So when I said you need to make all A's, that's for vet school. That is true, and that was the hardest part for me about school, because when I was you guys' age, I loved art classes, I loved science classes, but I didn't always make A's. Like I'm not a really good math student, and math has always been my hardest subject, and I struggled a lot, and I shed a lot of tears in school because math just doesn't really come naturally to me. And I think so often we think that, well, if I'm not good at it, then there's no way that I can do it. It's not possible. And I'll tell you a little secret. I now study genetics and DNA, but when I was in college as an undergrad, I took a genetics class for the first time, and I went to tutoring every single day, and I got a D. D as in dog. Like I almost didn't pass the class. And if you had told me that I was going to like genetics and study genetics in the future, I would have laughed at you. But I think it's important to say that, because even if you're not perfect, or you realize, well, actually, I really like this where I didn't like it before, that's okay. That's what school is for. It's for you to figure out being good at stuff. And if you're not good at something immediately, that doesn't mean that you're not going to get a job. That doesn't mean that being a veterinarian or a wildlife biologist isn't for you. It just means that maybe you didn't do really well on that test, and that's okay. And, you know, perseverance and finding new things that interest you is all part of your education. So it's important to make good grades eventually, but sometimes, you know, for me, it took me a little bit longer to figure out what I wanted to do. And when I went back to school to get another degree, my grades were really, really good because I knew what I liked. And it's okay if you're not super awesome at all of your classes right now. That's a great point, Jesse. Don't stress out too much about that.
Thanks, Imogene. That's great. All right, to Miss Parmar's class, if you guys want to come up and demute your mic, we'll take a question from you now. I love when all the hands go up in a class. Like that's the best feeling. Who to choose? So yeah, oh, you're good. Yep, good to go.
Okay, let's hear from Charlotte.
Yeah, you.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
I can.
Great.
My name is Charlotte, and how much family members do you have? And what are their names? And have you ever worked with a scorpion?
Okay, cool question. So the question is about my family, how many I have, and have I worked with scorpions? So I am an only child. But my family is really, really big. My mom has is one of 5. So that means I have a lot of cousins. And when we get together on holidays, there's a lot of people. My husband is also a wildlife biologist, and his family is even bigger than mine. He's got 11 aunts and uncles. So his family is enormous. But we're the only wildlife biologists in the family. And I have handled scorpions. But only because I have friends that study them. I don't really know a whole lot about scorpions, but they showed me how to hold them in the right way so I wouldn't get hurt and so they wouldn't get hurt. And they're very, very cool.
Awesome. That was a great answer, too. Actually, before we go to our last two questions, as we're running a little long, I just want to go back to salamanders really briefly. I know we're talking about cats, but you love salamanders. And salamanders are a creature that a lot of classes might be able to actually go see in the wild themselves. How does one find a salamander?
Yes. Okay. So if I was not studying big cats, I think that I would probably be studying salamanders, because salamanders are just the neatest critters there are. Salamanders are amphibians. They can be aquatic, which means they're in the water, or they can be terrestrial, which means they're on land. And there's a couple different times of the year that you can find them, depending on where you are in the world. The eastern half of the United States is a really great place to find them. But if you're like up in Toronto or in the southwestern United States, and even the western, there's so many places you can find them. I think the easiest way to find salamanders and other different reptiles, so you have to be careful, like that includes snakes, most of which are harmless, is what's called flipping. And flipping is when you're going out in the woods and you very gently like pick up a rock and kind of lift it up to see what's underneath. And salamanders, because they breathe through their skin, that's why they're slimy. That's why they're kind of like sticky feeling. It's because they have to have moist skin in order to breathe. So they stay underneath things that protect them from the sun and that prevents moisture. So when you lift up a rock like this, you can see a salamander and you can look at it. But when you're done, you always want to gently put the log or the rock back the way that you find it. You don't want to just leave the animal exposed, because like a bird might eat it, or another animal might eat it. But more importantly, you've removed the habitat. That's really important to find it. So if you want to see salamanders, if you're looking for terrestrial salamanders, that just means like going in the woods with like an adult or a parent and basically gently like flipping the logs, like I said. But you don't really want to touch them, because our skin can burn our skin can burn theirs, but it can also spread diseases. There are certain diseases that make it really hard for them to breathe through their skin, and it can kill them. So we don't want to touch them. So you just want to leave them where you found them. Or like in the spring and in the fall, you can often find salamanders under rocks in like really shallow streams, which is really, really fun. And that's a great activity that you can do with your parents, your friends, your family, as long as you know not to touch them, and you know that you're with an adult that can help you identify what you're looking at.
It's so nice to have someone who loves animals as much as we do here. Like that, you're so enthusiastic.
I do, yeah.
All right, let's go to Ms. Bergeron's class. If you guys have a question, come on up.
Okay, Seamus?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay.
My name is Seamus, and what are things people can do to help the population of big cats?
That's a great question. So the question was, what can we do to help populations of big cats? And I think some of the most important things involves, it's hard. So people ask this question a lot. It's really hard for young people sometimes to feel like they can make a difference, but you can make a difference. And that involves like talking to your parents and being responsible with things like what you pay for, what you buy, and where you go. So the most important that I think that you can do right now sitting in your classroom is to make sure that you're supporting important conservation efforts. So that means not going to the circus. That means not going to like private zoos where you can pay money to bottle feed a tiger, or you can go to a mall and hold like a baby lion for a photograph. That doesn't help conservation. Unfortunately, those are like businesses that people have where they're owning these animals as pets and they're exploiting them for profit. And what that means is they're breeding them, but they have to get them from somewhere, which means they often are taking them from the wild, which doesn't help the wild animals. If you want to support conservation, that means going to like accredited zoos and learning about the things that are important for like tiger conservation or for cheetah conservation. Cool things that you can do tomorrow is like, if one of you have a birthday coming up, one of the coolest things that I've seen kids do is that they work with organizations like the Cheetah Conservation Fund, and they have like a birthday fundraiser where they donate, they raise a little bit of money instead of getting gifts or in place of gifts, and they make a donation to the Cheetah Conservation Fund so they can help the cheetahs in Kenya or Namibia. And there are other organizations that you can do that with as well. Other things involve not buying products that have palm oil in them. Like for me, one of my favorite things to eat is Reese's peanut butter cups, but I don't buy them anymore because they use palm oil, and palm oil production in other parts of the world involves mowing down rainforests and cutting down trees that are really important habitat for so many species, not just big cats. So looking at labels, that sounds kind of boring, I know, and I'm really sad that I can't eat peanut butter cups anymore, but there's a lot of alternatives that you can find as well. And if you're interested in resources about like how to be involved as a kid or getting your family involved in different organizations, you can look up organizations that are looking for fundraisers, and that would be a great way for you to help as well.
Awesome. One of the groups that you didn't mention, probably because you work with them, but an outstanding, probably the best big cat research group in the world, accepting fundraisers, so Panthera. So the group that he works with directly, Panthera, do look them up. I'll pass along a link as well. If you guys are interested in contributing to big cat conservation, they're the people to work with.
Yep. Well, the last thing I'll say is Panthera does a really cool thing that classrooms, I think, are probably able to do. They have you can basically practice being a scientist because they have programs online where you can look at camera trap photos. So when we go out into the world and set a camera trap because we want to get a picture of a tiger or a picture of a snow leopard, like I showed you, there's going to be a bajillion other photos. Like if one blade of grass moves around a lot, you're going to get like 1,000 of those photos. And Panthera has a way for you to actually look at those photos to tell them, nope, that was an elephant, not a tiger. Oh, that was a person or a dog, and you can score it as well. So yeah, that's a great recommendation for things as well.
Super cool. All right, let's take one last question from Miss Park's group, who joined us a little bit in. So they're from Fallon, Nevada. If you guys just want to demute your mic, you're good to go. And then, yeah, the student comes running up. Awesome. I'll let you know when your guys are good. And then we'll finish off with you guys. So not yet. So the little microphone symbol at the top of your screen, guys. And then you should be able to ask. Sorry for the trouble. And dun, dun, dun. There you go. You're good.
I was wondering how you got to be so interested in big cats.
The question is how I got to be so interested in big cats. Well, I think that the simplest answer is that I've always thought they were very beautiful and very fascinating. And for me, as a scientist, when I worked on bobcats in Montana, I did that project because I had already worked with tigers at a sanctuary in like a captive setting. And I'm really just fascinated by animals that are able to live with really big requirements. Like they need a lot in order to survive. So like a bobcat or a tiger or a snow leopard, they need a lot of land. They need access to food and shelter and resources. And they have to do all of this while living alongside humans that sometimes really don't like them that much. And they're able to do all of these things in the face of so many, I guess, like roadblocks, really. And that really was interesting to me. And when you combine like their beauty and their ability to like run fast and jump high and, you know, catch these animals, you know, catch like, you know, big animals like wildebeest in order to, you know, raise families and survive for another day. That was something that I thought was just really, really cool and really worthwhile. Like I don't want to live in a world where there are no snow leopards. I don't want you to grow up and never have the chance to see a tiger because there are none left. And I think that being able to study an animal that like lives at the roof of the world in these really harsh environments is something that I feel responsibility for, because so often with these endangered species, like I said, we have 37 cats on the world, cat species in the world, and 35 of them are at risk of extinction. That's a problem that we've created. So I feel responsible for trying to do something to make life a little bit easier for them. And they're also very pretty, if I'm being honest.
Outstanding, Imogene. Thank you so much for joining us. So for the classes, boys and girls, if you guys could get ready and join me, and teachers, if you guys could demute everyone's microphone. What we always do at the end of every Hangout is if you guys could join me in saying a huge thank you to Imogene for joining us here today, that would be awesome. So yeah, go right ahead, guys. Thanks so much. Awesome. And it's been an amazing month, celebrating amazing women. We had Tori Linder earlier today doing Florida Panthers, so it's so nice to have a double big cat day. They're such amazing creatures. Imogene, that was awesome. Thanks so much for joining us, and of course, we look very forward to having you back as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks for asking great questions.